Good morning, everybody. As president of Civitas, I wish to welcome all participants to this first seminar on peace and Christian democracy, both people already belonging to our Civitas community and all newcomers. Civitas is an international network of research institutions, archives, and individual archivists and researchers focused on the history of worldwide Christian democracy. We mainly work on Christian democratic parties, of course, but also refer to Christian social movements, trade unions, and religious groups. As you have already heard, our communication language is obviously English. The reason for being today here is easy to explain. Last year, a major interstate war came back in Europe, with one country invading another and meeting desperate resistance. Hence, it is more than 1 year that our conscience, that is the conscience of man of the 21st century, faces old problems humankind has been debating for centuries. What are the conditions in which the prohibition all religions impose against killing may be overcome? Whether the Christian prescription not to resist evil proposed in the Sermon on the Mount implies a refusal even of self-defense. Whether there are conditions that make a war just, in the case which they are. Which are the best methods to prevent war? How it is possible to work for a dialogue between the fighting sides? Whether boycotts and sanctions are valuable instruments for promoting peace or not. The coming back of old dilemmas is not surprising. The history of peace and war issue demonstrates that self-defense is probably the most crucial point in the debate on war, differentiating absolute pacifism with other trends. The British historian Martin Siddle introduced an exciting distinction between what he calls pacifism and pacifism itself. According to him, pacifism is, I quote, the creed that every war is always wrong and that never should be made resort to it, whatever the consequences of abstaining from fighting. On the contrary, according to Siddle, pacifism is, I quote again, the idea that war, even though sometimes necessary, is always an irrational and inhuman way of solving disputes, and that its prevention must always be a primary importance political priority. Therefore, according to Siddle, pacifism is essentially a moral creed, a faith, and an ethics of ultimate ends, to quote Max Weber. And at the same time, pacifism is an ethics of responsibility and hence a political idea according to which reforms, rather than waiting for significant changes in human minds, represent the only realistic possibility of limiting the use of force. All those considerations bring us simply to a point to say that what we live in these days is challenging the deep roots of our culture and of the Christian conscience too. Our network, Civitas, studies Christian democracies. Christian democratic parties governed many European countries during the Cold War years. They had to face dramatic peace and war issues. The problem of the West-East confrontation itself, the invasion of South Korea, the invasion of Hungary, the atomic menace, the Cuban crisis, the Vietnam War, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Euro missiles crisis, the invasion of Afghanistan, the fall of the wall, the new wars of the 1990s, the war on terror. How did they manage all this? How did they face the dilemmas of pacifism, just war theory, deterrence, national sovereignty, international dialogue, war preventions, boycotts, and sanctions? We are convinced that the past has to be known for a better understanding of our societies, and even for not remaining prisoners of today, and being able to think of the future efficaciously. We are historians. We do not want to blame or praise. We want to understand. But we know that Christian democracy has been and is today one of the fundamental political families of our age, and that its heritage deserves to be fully appreciated. So this is the first of 3 seminars we will have in May and June for the summer break. And we begin today with the lecture of Professor Massimo De Giuseppe of the Milan University on the Italian case. Then, on June the 1st, Professor Ladislav Kabada of the Prague Metropolitan University will hold the second seminar on peace and human rights, focusing on the influence of Christian democratic thought on Eastern dissenters. And the third seminar will be on June the 26th with the lecture of Professor Bastian Matteo Schanna from the University of Potsdam on German Christian Democratic Union and German foreign policy. After the summer, 2 new events will follow. We are still working on them. Before beginning, I wish to thank Loredana Teodoresto of the Istituto Luigi Sturzo for her outstanding work in preparation for these seminars, and together with her, all the 3 speakers who accepted our invitation. Let's pass on to the program. Professor De Giuseppe is widely known in our community, but I give some essential information to those who have not met him. He is full professor of contemporary history in the Ulm Department of Humanities in Milan. De Giuseppe has analyzed international history through the lenses of social and religious movements. Besides studying the relationships between America and Europe, with particular attention to the cases of Mexico and Central America, he has published many books devoted to the history of contemporary Latin America, to the Mexican Revolution, to state church and indigenous peoples in Mexico. Well, Professor De Giuseppe, besides this, has devoted many works to personalities, groups, and associations linked to these movements. His more recent book is dedicated to the diplomacy of the cities, the Italian politician Giorgio La Pira and the World Federation of the United Cities. But he has published other volumes on La Pira as prophet of dialogue and as a mayor and his ways of peace. He has also edited, together with Guido Formigoni, another volume devoted to the writings on peace and war of Don Primo Mazzolari and other charismatic personalities of the Italian Catholic pacifism. His today lecture is devoted to the international peace projects and the Italian Democratic Christian Party. So my work finishes here. The floor is to Professor De Giuseppe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Moro, and thank you very much to Loredana and Istituto Luigi Sturzo in Rome for organizing this very interesting series of webinars and about the transnational connection of democratic Christian experiences and the linking with the peace history. That it's something that is still growing in these days on an academic level and research level. So I will start, Professor Moro just presented the two major actors of my paper of today that are Don Primo Mazzolari in the first part of the paper, and the main one that is Giorgio Lapira, that was a very peculiar personality in Italian and international history. He was originally from the south of Sicily, from Pozzallo, a very small place, is nowadays very famous because it's one of the hub of immigration in Italy from Tunisia and from the northern part of Africa. In good days, you can see Africa from Pozzallo. He was a very peculiar Christian. He entered in the San Vincenzo company during the 20s, but he was a strong innovator in the idea of charity, of compassion, of the idea of building a structural vision of charity. And then he was a professor of laws, of diritto romano in the Florence University for many, many years until his last days. He was an important anti-fascist, very peculiar anti-fascist in Florence during the end of the 30s and the first part of the Second World War. He was one of the ideal founder of the left wing, now I'm simplifying a little bit, of the Democratic Christian Party with other important actors usually inserted in the Gruppo Dossettiano, the Cronache Sociali. He was a member of the Constitutional Assembly. He had a very important role in the thinking of the Italian Constitution, and then was, after a short experience as Subsecretary of Work and working on a plan for popular buildings in Italy, was for a long, long time, from 551 until 65, mayor of Florence, and the main actor of a lot of peace projects starting from Florence and connecting with a lot of different actors in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and obviously inside of Europe. Inside the Catholic world and outside the Catholic world, and obviously inside and mainly outside of the democratic Christian experiences. So I will start my short presentation. Let me try to use some images. Okay, I hope you can see. Starting with a quote by Don Primo Mazzolari. Don Primo Mazzolari was a priest from the south of Lombardia, one of the ideal founder of the Democratic Christian Party. He was an anti-fascist, very original anti-fascist during the 30s. And he was a very original builder of a pacific, it was really interesting, this quote of Professor Moro, pacifistic and pacifist. I think it was in some way both of them. Don Primo Mazzolari started as a young, patriotic, resurgimental, idealized young man, as a young priest, and it ended like a sort of Catholic Gandhian author of a very important book for the history of Catholic pacifism that was called Tu non uccidere, Don't Kill, that was published anonymous and during the 50s, and then with the name of the author after the death of Don Primo Mazzolari in 59. So I start with this quote. Is a quote from end of the October 27 of 46, after the war, and Primo Mazzolari wrote in a very popular newspaper magazine, Catholic magazine called L'Italia, a short article simply entitled The Appeal. The world is once again in the temptation of war. Interest, rancors, prejudice hide badly behind the stiffening of not good wills that do not want peace. It's not true that they don't want it. Everyone wants it. Everyone wants it peace, but in their own way. They want his personal peace. For wanting too many pieces, the specter of war is reappearing. As a fatal means of untying, the knot grows bigger every day. Melt, cut, faced with the imminent threat, the unfortunate adventures on the other wall of the new war, on the future war, hope to make up for new opportunities, cultural, political, economical opportunities, the lucky ones, to continue with the abundance of war. And in the end of this article, Don Primo Mazzolari states, it's all the same. It feels bad in peace. It feels bad in war. Professional revolutionaries who love trouble cry out against everyone, against the greed and against the small, against armaments, against the atomic bomb. But we realize that they do it without conviction, and with a secret hope that we will soon jump on them. Long live the war, not even those who wanted there to shout it, but for convenience not to appear criminal. There are also those who really don't want war and hate and condemn it, just as it is a delirium of the streets. But where can we make our voices heard? Who listens to us? Who can we trust in our field and in outside fields? That was the great issue with this Cremonese priest that was in this article entering a very interesting dialogue with another trade unionist, rural trade unionist from the southern of Lombardy and between the border with Emilia, Guido Miglioli. That was related with the position of the Democratic Christian Party, the Young Democratic Christian Party of Gasperi, with respect of war and peace issues. That was really important because Primo Mazzolari in a short time will start a project of a magazine called, let me see why it's L'Italia, called Adesso, that was starting a new idea of relation of the peace issues with the Catholics, with the Democratic Christian Party, with the Pope, and with the idea of West and East. That was really interesting because the controversy over the definition of pacifism that for a good part of the 20th century saw historian, philosopher, militants of various causes engaged was related, according to Mazzolari, to a very changing and transforming panorama. And the idea of Mazzolari was to develop the capacity to rate the scenario, the panorama that was changing. And that's really interesting, the transformation of his thoughts between the 46, the 47, the 48, the 49, with, for example, the great debate in Italy around the NATO, North American Treaty Organization basis in Italy, and the transformation of the atomic race, obviously, as part of this changing in peace sensibility. It's really interesting, for example, that during this first stage of the peace debate in the post-war Italy, an age that was obviously dominated, as is very well known by the historian, by the central role of World Peace Council, and for the Italian case, the Partigiani della Pace, the Partisan of Peace, between the project of Zdanovian project of Wroclaw in 48, then coming from the foundation of the WPC in Paris in 49, the direction of the presidency of Frédéric Joliot-Curie, the important role of intellectuals like Pablo Picasso on a global level, and then changing from the Stockholm appeal of 1950, the Vienna conference 2 years later, until the 53, I think between 48 and 53, there is this big monopoly of the peace issues built around a Soviet and communist project. And it's really interesting, for example, here we can see a very famous image of the presentation of Guernica in Milan, in Palazzo Reale in the autumn of 53, because this was part of a very complicated relation within the Democratic Christian Party with the theme of peace and the atomic race. For example, this exhibition of Picasso is very interesting because in June of 53, Picasso was invited to Rome to organize a big exposition in Palazzo delle Esposizioni, organized by a very important communist intellectual like Lionel Venturi. But Picasso refused to offer Guernica because the subsecretary of the council presidency, Giulio Andreotti, didn't want very explicitly the exhibition of the new Picasso painting called Massacre in Korea. And so after some months of negotiation, the Milanese city council with Major Virgilio Ferrari from Partito Social Democratic Party, Milan has a centristic majorship with Democratic Christians, Social Democratic, Liberals, and Republicans, decided to offer the Palazzo Reale, that was still signed from the bombing during the Second World War, to present another Picasso exhibition. And this time Picasso offered Guernica, that came directly from New York to Milan, to be exhibited on the other side of 3 big paintings called Peace, Wars, and Massacre in Korea. It's really interesting. I have not the time here to enter in the debate in Milan local community of Democratic Christian about the exhibition of Picasso, but it's interesting that in this first age between the end of the 30s, the first part of the 50s, we have a sort of very complicated relation of the Catholics and the Democratic Christian with the peace issue. It's interesting, for example, that a couple of months before the starting of the Korean War in March 1950, another very original Catholic pacifist called Giovanni Pioli wrote a little booklet of 23 pages titled Catholics and Military Conscription, in response to some articles published by the Civiltà Cattolica, the Jesuit journal, in particular to the well-known condemnation of the objection of conscience formulated by Father Messineo. Pioli, that was another very peculiar and curious intellectual, was a former priest, former vice rector of the Pontifical Seminary of Propaganda Fide, had been one of the protagonists of the modern season alongside with Mario Rossi and Ernesto Buonaiuti, collaborating under the pseudonym of Dr. Aschenbröden with magazines such as Cenobium, Monova, etc. And after giving up his priestess, he devoted himself to pedagogy, writing, translating classic. He traveled to England, he traveled to the US, to Mexico, where he got to know the experience to the War Resisters League, the British section of the YRI. And in French, participating in the International Spiritualist Congress of 31 of Kardec in Holland. From the end of the Second World War, he became involved in the pacifist cause, becoming from 46 to be the promoter and referent in Italy of War Resisters International. In this little pamphlet, Pioli went far beyond the debate on the objection and the role of democratic Christian in respect of peace issues, which from the explosion of the Pina case, one of the first non-objectors to military recruitment, has slowly begun to ferment through 49, involving, in addition to non-violence, not Catholics, critical with Catholics such as Aldo Capitini or Mondo Marcucci, and the Social Democratic Parliamentary Calosso, promoter of the first bill of the Catholic Gino Giordani. Pioli, who was a firm supporter on non-denominational religious liberalism, controversially wondered why Italian Catholics, and specifically the Italian Democratic Christian Party, paid so little attention to international pacifism. In particular to that ecumenical origin and even of Catholic brand, even if this was totally unrelated to the mobilization of the partisan of peace. Pioli never entered and never supported the partisan of peace, considering a communist partisan version of the pacifist issue. To substantiate his own thesis and contest the Jesuit, who had defined pacifism pro-objection as a caricature of Catholicism, Pioli resorted to a series of concrete cases. For example, he wrote in the incipit, last May 49, in New York, arrested Pierre Morin, founder of the monthly pacifist newspaper The Catholic Worker, so strongly anti-capitalist and pacifist and anti-communist at the same time, offered the newspaper to appear like a reactionary communist daily worker. That was brought in time. And the Democratic Christian in Italy are doing the same with all the real pure pacifists. Crowds of workers from the slums of Manhattan, representative of cardinals, rich religious orders, poor laymen from all parts of the United States, crowded around his coffin to pay his last tribute to affection and veneration. For many of them, he was a saint, but the two fundamental points of the reform he preached were usurious capitalism and dehumanization of the worker. So, in Italy, what are we doing around pacifism? What is doing Democratic Christian Party? Is possible in Italy to participate in a modern warfare, as always, recognizing that participating in a modern warfare is always bad, and to be Christian is to be pacifist. Why is so difficult to accept for the Democratic Christian politicians? Pioli obviously was a very critical with respect of many of the Catholic intellectuals of the 30s and the 50s of the first part of the Cold War, but also very critical with the Democratic Christian Party. But it's really interesting that Pioli, that had very little connection with Don Primo Mazzolari, not directly a connection with La Pira, help us to understand the necessity of building as historian a sort of periodization of this changing state of the perception of peace in the first part of the Cold War in Italy, and the perception of peace in the Democratic Christian and inside the Catholic, very complex and articulate and Baroque, I would like to say, Italian world. So the periodization, I think that we have to understand that talking about Catholic pacifism, we can consider, for example, in this first part of the war of the Cold War, 3 stages. The first one is what we could consider an age of experimentation, rediscovery, and difficult of missed contacts. The starting date can be placed in the period between the slight outwards of the Cold War, 47 probably, with an acceleration following the signing of the Atlantic Pact, the conclusion and the suspension from the Korean conflict, and the entry in the thermonuclear age after the access of the Soviet to the H-bomb in the summer of 53. I think that's a first part that it's very easy to consider a laboratorian construction of peace, a complex era that coincided with the monopoly of political and mass pacifism by the partisans of peace, as I say. Then there is a sort of a second phase that is connected with the gradual coming out in the open of new adventures, which I try to reconstruct in the creation of an old Congress some years ago in Florence. That was from 54, I think it was really important, the construction and then the impact of the Pope radio message for Christmas of 54, that was a sort of opening to action for many, one, the few Catholic pacifists, also inside the Democratic Christian Party, this opening of Pius XII on the commitment of peace, on the publication. And I think that this second stage can cross the 60s and the changes of the 60s, especially the end of the 50s with the eruption also of the third world issues inside the pacifist issues until the first part of the 60s with the Pace in Terris Giovanea, the impact of the Cuban crisis, and then all the transformation of Vatican Council. Obviously, it's interesting that in this second stage, there is a radical changing in the connection between politicians, scientists, and public opinion. There is the big impact of the Bikini experiment, the big impact of the Einstein-Russell appeal, the Bandung Conference that inserted in the active neutralism of Nehru the theme of the nuclearization and denuclearization, the Suez crisis, obviously, with the new redefinition between West and East issues with North-South issues. And the last part, the third one, is between, I think, the 62, 61, that coincided also with the first peace march in Italy, organized by Capitini from Perugia to Assisi, until the 67, 68, with the big escalation of the Vietnam War, the Not Proliferation Treaty, and another changing of the consciousness of what is the real use of the flexible response strategy from part of the US. I think these three stages can change radically the presence, the connection of the democratic Christian with respect of the peace, the nuclear race, the pure pacifism, the connection with the Gandhian issues, etc., etc. With respect of the first part, I think it's really interesting that during the end of the 30s and the first part of the 50s, when there is this monopoly of Communist Party, partisan of peace, the Italian pacifist has been dominated by the sort of controversial relation with atomic fear. The activism of Partigiani della Pace, the hesitance of the silent majority, as was called, the political protest made by left-leaning movements, the non-violence against the presence of NATO bases, experiencing the schematization imposed by the Cold War through the media, produced a very polarized situation. The position of non-violence like Aldo Capitini or Lanza del Vasto, the failed attempt of Mazzolari with Avanguardia Cristiana demonstrated the difficulty of creating communication beyond alignments and ideologies. So I think the real first changing will start in some ways in the first year of the 50s. In order to not enter too Tony parts, we will limit ourselves to developing some elements through the second stage, the stage that was starting from 24. That is also 54. That is also a very interesting stage to present the real original role that was developed by this little man from Sicily, transforming a Florentine major called Giorgio La Pira. I think La Pira was interested, obviously, in the peace issues from the 30s. His journal Principi in Florence started in 39 and finished in the first 40s, was a strong condemnation of the Second World War and the participation of Italy with Germany in Nazi Germany in the war. But Lapira used the 30s to develop a very original discourse around the connection between social justice, peace, and international relation, or transnational relation would be better to present the cases. I think in the 30s, he read Capitini, Dolci, Danza del Vasto. Also was connected with Mazzolari, obviously was invited in Florence to talk about peace with Miglioli, with Maria di Campello, with Maria Baiocco Remidi, all interesting and original actors of the Catholics' sensibility to peace issues. But I think he also started to develop something really original. I think the real starting was not, as usually the apologists of Lapira say, the first letter that Lapira wrote to Stalin during the first week of the Korean War to invite the dictatorship of USSR to convince the Chinese and the North Korean to abandon very quickly the new war. But I think the interesting changing is leaving a sort of we can consider a sort of growth between 53 and 54, and it's a sort of perception of Lapira of the changing connection of the real danger related to the atomic fear and the atomic race that the H-bomb is starting to produce, and at the same time the construction of the strategy coming from above to create a mobilization. Lapira is a very intelligent and curious person who read a lot, read Beveridge, read Keynes, at the same time read a lot of scientists writing about the atomic issues, and is interested in develop a strategy to defend the citizenship with respect of the real danger of this bipolar system that is entering in a new impossible age of war, as Lapira said in various occasions, through the deterrence, the detente issues. So the real coming out of Lapira around this pacifist strategy that in some way can be pacifistic also, is this course, is speech at Geneva Conference of Red Cross of April 54. But Lapira presented a sort of new strategy. Here we can see with the French Abbé Pierre at in Geneva at the Red Cross, a strategy that it's talking about the right of the city to defend the citizen, not only from the nuclear war and from the risk of a new war, of an atomic apocalyptic new war, but also from the ingerence of the state. It's a sort of this very important speech called The Deep Value of the City is, I think, a sort of statement that create the real capacity of Lapira to build dialogues with different actors from pacifist and non-pacifist war to create a real project of peace. For example, before going to Geneva, Lapira encounters some members of the Center of Nonviolence founded by Aldo Capitini in Perugia, and while never managing to completely go beyond the boundaries of a radical movement, not even after the the 60s and the success of the first Perugia season march, he was able to project suggestion with a very original international capacity of mobility on a local and international horizon. Giorgio La Pira, in this case, decided to organize a very important series of conferences in Florence. The two opening acts of Florence New International Policy can consider the project of the Convegni per la pace e la civiltà cristiana, Congresses for Peace and Christian Civilization. The first idea was invented in the Epiphany of 52, on that symbolic day of the Christian calendar. La Pira summoned the members of cities and consular corps, and to this he delivered a message addressed to respective government, which was both a wish for peace and an invitation to participate in a new initiative on international scope, which was to take place in the Tuscan capital the following spring, the spring of 52. The first Congress was titled Civilization and Peace, Civiltà e Pace. The message was written in this way. Florence invites your government to send here next May qualified representative of culture and politics. They will meet to proceed with an exchange of ideas on the current condition, not only of Christian civilization and Christian party and the Christian world, but also on the permanent capacity that we possess to be valid instrument of peace and unification of people. This took shape the first of the Conference of Peace and Christian Civilization, which was held in Palazzo Vecchio in Florence from 23 to 28 of June of 52. And that was the first occasion when La Pira started to talk about the right of the city to defend themselves from the states, something that then will be more articulate in his Geneva speech in 1 year and a half after. Understood by the major as a sort of new council, this appointment became a cultural and political meeting place for all nations, even those divided by metal or radioactive containment. Representatives of 33 countries from Europe, Asia, and America joined that first meeting, and 16 governments sent them delegates. For the Italian, the Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs Taviani was present. For the OEC, Dalla Costa, the Archbishop of Florence. La Pira did the honors of the house, expressing himself in this term. Florence has really become tonight, and will become increasingly in the coming days, the asylum of spirituality, of beauty, of the need of peace, of the Italian, of the whole world citizenship, in which all nations open to the life-giving breath of the gospel they really meant. This is a singular meeting, one of a kind, certainly the first, a conference symbolically entitled Civilization and Peace, intended to verify the firmness of the foundation and the master wall of this ancient but ever so valid edifice of human civilization generated and perfected by gospel. Despite the conciliar quotation, it could not fail to appear explicit on that this strong Christian orientation was open to a strong attitude to ecumenism. In this first conference were invited representatives from Islam world and from Hebraic world, from the Eastern Bloc countries, that was to be realized only during the second conference next year in 53, called Gospel and Poetries. And among the intervention of the first meeting, the idea to contain the anti-communist sentiment that was prevailing in most of the Catholic participants in the conference. In the report, for example, of the American law, a supporter of the U.S. mission in defense of the Christianity, La Pira was well aware of the situation and the difficulty inside the democratic Christian. Again, Andreotti was very diffident with respect to this project, and Fanfani was the historically in these years the first reference together with Enrico Mattei of Giorgio La Pira, And the Democratic Christian did not participate officially as a party representative in the conference. If his aim was to lay the foundation stone for building the future foundation of a dialogue, undoubtedly, with the first meeting in Florence, the ice was broken, and the Lapira project would start to become more relevant after 54. 54 was the organization of the Geneva Conference, and then connected to the Geneva Conference, the organization of the third Civilization and Christian Congress in Florence, called Culture and Revelation, that was the most political of the first congresses. And at the same time was the Congress where Lapira started to think and to organize the next Congress of Major of the World that will be organized for the idea started in 54. The Congress was held in 55 with the presence of major from the US and from the USSR. So this concept of promoting a new form of dialogue around peace were reaffirmed by the major in his final appeal, where he said, Mrs. Representative of the nation, what is the final act of this conference? What is the design of the bridge that can unite and still disunite shores of civilized nation through parties, cultural and religious experiences? The answer is clear. The peace is possible. The construction of a solid bridge also. If one does not accept the cornerstone from which the entire building draws strength, we are in a very difficult way. Our politician has to understand this element. For Lapira, Christian society had to commit itself to the bottom line of dialogue between nations and between the basic elements, the cities. And this vision of peace is also forcefully reflected in the significant correspondence started in that year with the cloistered nuns, with the aim of establishing a dialogue between two levels which would unite contemplative and action, political action and contemplative action, small and large, starting what Lapira considers as a necessary process of circulation of grace. This same concept then reaffirmed in different terms between 54 and 55 would became the big strategy of Lapira, a big strategy that after the noses to the word of Albert Einstein and Bertrand Russell, who put the attention around the real problem of the atomic age, the radioactivity, was translated in a new action to create the Mediterranean Sea, not in a neo-Atlantistic way like many historians has inserted Lapira for many years in a sort of dialogue with the neo-Atlanticism, but with a very original idea of a proto-denuclearization of the old Lago di Tiberiade, the Sea of Tiberiade, the sea of the Abraham family, and the sea that invited Lapira to create networks, web, with Arabs, with Golda Meir, with Nasser, through Mattei, but not only through Mattei, after the Bandung Conference and the Suez Crisis that created a very strong connection, especially between Lapira and the Egyptian minister Taha Hussein and the Israeli Johan Levi Lowenson, that were the main actors in this project of dialogue built by Lapira, a project that also consider a sort of creation of geography of peace through the journey that Lapira organized between the north and south part of the Mediterranean Sea and between Russia and US. So we're not many times, we are finishing. I come directly to another short part of this position of Lapira that was very original, as I said, inside the Democratic Christian Party. For example, after the bikini experiments in 54, in the second stage when Linus Pauling received the Nobel Prize of Chemistry, and some years after, in 1962, the Nobel Peace Prize. Lapira was really impressed by the new role of the scientist to create a connection with politicians and public opinion around the necessity to survive. It's interesting that after the Bikini experiment, the Catholic newspaper L'Italia, traditionally against the pacifist claims of the Communist Party, highlighted the necessity to avoid new trials after the disaster of the Bikini. And there is an interesting interview with Lapira, also in the newspaper, socialist newspaper L'Avanti, talking about the role of scientists, talking about a dialogue with the Japanese scientist Iwao Otsuka about the atomic rush, the atomic powder, etc., etc. The Italian left wing shared in this theory and, for example, was interpreted the Minister of Foreign Affairs around the possible subscription to the statement of other government heads, given the concert and the indignation produced by the H-bomb experimentation in Bikini. Is really interesting that the Christian Democrat Zaccagnini gave a proper reconstruction of the failure of 8 years of efforts towards a solution aimed at forbidding the atomic weaponry, quoting in his turn the president of the Atomic Energy Commission, Strauss, and the Eastern speech of the Pope. So the position of the Italian government, the Democratic Christian, during this second, this post the Gasperiana age of the half of the 50s, emerged in the speech of Mario Scelba before the election. The head of the government gave his own interpretation of the political consequences of the atomic rush, and his theory was based on pre-assumption, the division of the war into two opposing blocks as sort of a natural situation, the overwhelming superiority of conventional Soviet weaponry and the balancing use of the atomic weaponry made by the Western government as a necessity. And declaring himself against the war, Scelba came to the following conclusion. At this condition, the prohibition of nuclear weapons could produce as an immediate consequence the breaking of the balance of powers between the two blocs. It could be the starting of a third world war and the end of the weakest nation. Italy doesn't have an atomic arsenal. It's not a member of the United Nations. Next year will be part of the United Nations, an organization created to save the peace. But our country doesn't have a direct role in the international crisis, and we have to defend our position inside the Atlantic Alliance. This official position of the Democratic Christian Party was in some way, what can I say, was considered with a real politique from Lapira, but Lapira used, after the Pope Christus message of 54, the idea of move from and build a new original way to go outside of this official real politique of the Christian Democrats. Giorgio Lapira, and now I came to the conclusion, took personal steps at that time that caused great sensation on international level. He gave birth to a peace campaign through convention, cultural exchanges, invitation, letters, journey, dialogue with governors, entering correspondence with Malenkov from 53 and will be with Khrushchev after 56, urging the necessity of peace. Overall, the Catholic press was sensitive to the matters of religion and peace. After the appeal of Vienna of 55, Lapira worked to create an anti-nuclear consensus also inside the young Catholics. Here we are, for example, in the last part, and I close my speech. If we have questions, we can obviously dialogue. This is the idea after 61, the peace march, to invite Utant, the new General Secretary of the United Nations, to Florence to give a sort of connection with the project of the deep value of the city and the UN, that it's the first part of the new road that after 65, after the journey to Vietnam, Lapira will recover inside International Federation of United Cities. Here the connection with Thomas Merton, that was very important. I made a research about the relation between Merton and Lapira around the necessity to bypass the political party in the US and in Italy, in this case the Democratic Christian, in center-left age, to create a conscience with the young Catholics around the necessity to bring a new form of peace. But it's not referred as pacifist. Lapira never considered himself a pacifist or a pacifistic, but he considered himself a peace builder in many ways. So Lapira dialogue with the CIPRI research report, entering the World Peace Council during the Ramchandra presidency, and Lapira will dialogue during the 66, 67, 68 with younger generation that have this, for example, is a photograph from a meeting of young democratic Christian in Palalido in Milan in 67, when the idea of pure pacifism is obviously in a sort of big radical transformation, where Martin Luther King is presented together with Ernesto Che Guevara and the priest killed in Colombia, Camilo Torres, where they say three different ways, only one objective, that is peace. So we finish with these images. This is one, is an old Lapira in 73, in front of a very symbolic place in Rome that all the Italian knows, and dialoguing with young students coming from different parts of Italy, and in this case is organized with young democratic Christian to create a sort of longue durée connection around pacifism from this very peculiar, that I think all of us know, places in the center of Rome, talking about the idea of peace for the new generation in the starting of the 70th decade, a very complicated decade for Italy and for the world.
Thank you. Thank you, Massimo.
Welcome, Renato.
Thank you for this really interesting and especially thought-provoking, I think, lecture. Lapira's personality is so impressive. It was at the same time, I think, a product of the Italian Christian democratic culture. And at the same time, it was probably the most radical expression of it on the peace issue. So a very fascinating figure. I may only add, Massimo, probably if you may take away your slides. Yes. So I have only listed 4 very interesting points your lecture implies. That is the problem of the politicization of peace, the problem of how much the atomic issue influences still today any peace discourse, the problem of the interrelation between peace and international social justice, and fourth, very interesting problem, the role of citizens, the role of citizenship in the building of peace. But I do not want to occupy the floor. This is a seminar. Our aim was to start a dialogue, so I open the floor to everybody who has to dialogue with you, for questions, for observations, for comments. So the floor is open to everybody now. Well, while we are waiting only to open the floor, I have a question. That is, I was impressed by the problem of the dialogue inside the Cold War framework with the communist movement, the partisans of peace. Because according to me, this is one of the fundamental and crucial problems with peace. That is, it's inevitable, question mark, politicization. That is, the communists, they politicized peace during the Cold War. They pretended to be the party of peace while the West was not it. So they monopolized, in a certain sense, every discourse on peace. And we know very well how much this conditioned all the debate. The same case of La Pira you were mentioning, many of the resistances inside Christian democracy in front of La Pira's initiatives were exactly because of this. You risk to support the communist cause. Well, my question is general. After studying peace, what do you think about this issue? That is, how is possible not to become prisoner of this politicization of peace? Is this inevitable? What, from an historian point of view, we may think?
Well, that's really interesting, because I think politicization is the main issues, obviously. And I think, as I try with a very schematic periodization that I try to draw, that between 48 and 53, maybe 54, basically between 48 and 53, you have a very strong difficulty to go outside of this instrumentalization of impossibility to break the monopoly of the Communist Party around the peace. There are obviously a lot of voices, Pioli, Capitini, the Lanza del Vasto, all these cases that I quoted, but they were minority cases and not able to have a strong impact with a big public opinion or big press and so on. So I think until 53 is really difficult, but between 53, 54, 55, we really experience a change, not only in the Cold War, in the relation Washington, Moscow, and obviously with the allies of the two poles, but I think there is something new in many senses. There is the perception of that time was not called North-South, but the North-South issue that is coming from Bandung, and before Bandung, from China, from many actors that are changing a little bit the perception of what is war and what is the capacity of the actors to, also Italy, for example, the Italy of Mattei and La Pira, to enter in these new horizons that are opening. And I think this changes the very schematic elements of the first part of the Cold War. Is a sort of globalization of war and peace that is changing not only the international relation, but also the perception of the more clever actors that are trying to read what is happening. Pira, for example, is very impressed by Lai in 52, 53, and he thinks that China, at the moment was a very strong pair of USSR, is producing something new. And the Korean War, I think, is a sort of breakthrough in this way. And if you move from Korea, Bandung, Suez Crisis, non-aligned movement, the neutral activism of Nehru, a lot of these things are perceived not only from Capitini. For example, when Capitini in 54 tried to create an Italian version of Third World Camp, was not called Third World, but Third World Camp, that was a project originally born in the Adrian Mast Peacemaker in the US. Lapira is really interested in these elements. And Lapira is perceiving that something is changing inside the Catholic world, inside democratic Christian, the possibility of the dialogue with Fanfani, the dialogue with Mattei. A couple of years ago, I made an investigation in the Lapira archive around his role during the Suez Crisis. And it's really interesting because during the Suez Crisis, Lapira and Mattei are talking all the time about the possibility to create peace spaces in the Mediterranean, building a dialogue with Nasser and with the new actors that are coming out from the Middle Eastern area. So I think it's a sort of perception that it's not only the two big ones. There are new actors that are entering, and this is a little bit breaking the monolithic politicization of the first part. And if you see after the Vienna appeal also, and obviously this is related with atomic race, but the approach of USSR is changing, and USSR with all is monopolistic vision, but it's a little bit more open to dialogue after Stalin with peculiar actors like Lapira, that then in 55 invited the mayor of Moscow in Florence, but in 59 is invited Kremlin at Soviet Supremo to as the first Catholic to speak in front of the course.
Only last very brief comment. Do you think that we are facing again the same problem? That is, even today, peace is politicized, and peace needs to be free from political implication in a certain sense?
That's real. That's a very big issue of nowadays international affairs. I think the other thing I inserted, I was very schematic in my presentation, but I inserted the reference to Einstein-Russell appeal because Lapira understood the real changing element of the 50s, that if you can move the conscience, especially of the young generation, around the real danger of atomic race, that it's radioactivity, then you can create pressure to the governments and create a real mobilization. Lapira is really clear around this in many of his writings, speeches, etc. So I think now we are in a very strange situation, because if you look after the war on terror, the nuclear element disappeared. As we know, the arsenal were very similar to the arsenal of before the SALT agreements, but it was outside of the public debate. So now we are in a very strange situation, because we don't have a real debate around the deepness element of this controversial new Cold War, as we can call it, in a very more complicated globalized world. And that's a little bit a paradox, because if we see our younger generation are sensible only on two elements, gender and climate change.
Environment.
So environment in general. And so I think the only way that a peace discourse around a new mobilization could pass from these two big elements. And obviously the technology of the media is something that changed all between the 50s, the 60s, and this first part of new wars of 21st century. Apparently, we are returning to big classical wars of Clausewitz war, but I think it's not exactly this. Also because they are very private war in many ways.
Yes. Thank you. I think we have still some minutes, possibly. And I ask if there are other comments or questions or interventions in general.
Sorry,
Yes.
I don't have here a button to raise my hand, so I'm really sorry. I'm just
okay.
On my mic. Okay. Hi, and thank you.
May you introduce yourself for the
sure.
audience?
I'm Laura Ciglioni, currently adjunct professor at La Sapienza, contemporary history. I've been studying atomic cultures in Italy, France, and the US mostly. And the Gulf War, the peace movement during the Gulf War. So my question to Massimo, and thank you so much for your lecture, is about politicization as well in some way, but from a different perspective. I was wondering, what's your opinion on the relationship between Lapira especially and the party? Meaning, do you think that the fact that there was a gap, a distance somehow between his positions and also in his perspective, as you were saying, that was basically a very global perspective that was looking beyond the state to different actors and citizens and the personal network of contacts and the Mediterranean denuclearization. And so do you think that this points to a more long-term problematic relationship between pacifist movements or peace builders in general and politics? And party politics especially. So if you see here, there's like a few Bruges. And then looking forward to the 1970s and 80s especially, if you think that somehow in this way, Lapira was in advance, was somehow talking about issues that would explode later, meaning, how peace and peace issues and pacifists would be part of the big transformation in the relationship between citizens and politics in the 1970s and 1980s that maybe is still ongoing. And so whether somehow would point his finger to this very particular problem here and how also identity issues and gender issues would change completely the relationship between party politics and peace and global peace in general. And then my final question is that if you think that in the end, this gap between his politics and party politics was, somehow something that hindered his path, or if in the end it was, a plus, was a positive tool that, was ahead of his times, maybe yes, but then it was very positive and, somehow, let's say, seminal. Thanks.
No, that's really interesting. Lapira believes in politics. He wrote, I think there are two seminal books of him from 44, at the end of the Second World War, when he was in Rome, hidden after an attack from Banda Carità, a group of fascists in Florence, protected by Montini. And one is called La nostra vocazione sociale, and the other one is called Le premesse della politica. There are two little books that are really interesting to understand the concept of policy for Lapira. Many times it's considered like an Italian version of Maritain, but it's very original. Lapira has a very coherent process of consider the importance, the essential of institutions. Is very politics in many ways. He was one of the first supporters of Democratic Christian Party, but he was never inscribed to the Democratic Christian Party. That's an element that, for example, we can see also in the relation of the democratic Christian politics that are more appreciated from La Pira, that are originally Fanfani, than Aldo Moro in later years. And I think that this is part. Sometimes I have the feeling that La Pira is a sort of Catholic anarchist. He doesn't want to be controlled. He wants to use the policy to reach high-level issues, what is used to call la tavola dei valori, this sort of big Christian elements of his concept of politics, with a great conception of the historical dimension of policy, because he conceived the policy as part of an historical process, and he used to connect the analysis of the daily problems with a very deep connection with the historical roots of these problems. But he needs to be free from the party. I quote a little example. In 61, for example, La Pira wants very strongly to reaffirm the necessity of open a public debate around the conceptual subjection. And he used a movie from Otan Lara called Tu non ucciderai, you will not kill. He doesn't like the movie. You see, the movie was presented in the Vex exhibition of 61, then was banned because of the theme. The Italian government banned the movie from the screening. La Pira saw the movie. He didn't like it, but he understood the possibility to use this movie to open public debate. And in this case, for example, just at the time Parliament was discussing the legislation concerning censorship, La Pira used the sort of transformation of the concept of morality, saying that this movie was a moral movie, a real moral movie attacking the censorship in Italy. And exploded a controversy because at this time numerous directors of important Italian newspaper had taken position around the distributing of the movie. And La Pira decided to invite to Florence, the director, invite all the editors of the newspaper and organize a private exhibition of screening of the movie in a Florentine cinema. And that was a very complicated situation because La Pira was attacked by Andreotti very directly. There was a denunciation of La Pira by a private citizen who would have resulted in the only judicial proceeding against the major. And this element was considered from if you look at the evolution of the debate about the object consciousness in between 61 and 65 was seminal in the old rebuilding, the reopening of the door around this issue. Dom Milani, the new laws, all started from this project of La Pira, and was a very strong element because if you look at the for example, the documents of Andreotti against La Pira are very, very hard against him. He say that he's destroying the role of democratic Christian parties, destroying the role of the government, is a sort of craziness of La Pira. And La Pira is defending this movie that he didn't like it, to create an open, real debate. And that's typical, that's a typical case of La Pira action that I think help us to understand his relation with the politics. One side, he wanted to politize in his way these issues, but on the same time, he wanted to be free from the party direction. That's, if you look, Lapira has a couple of experiences inside the parliament, and it wasn't the best moment of his life. The best moment of his life were always outside of the parliament. With saying that Lapira has an incredible respect of the institutions.
Thanks. Thank you.
About the prophecy, obviously, we're talking as historian and not as theologist, but I think Lapira was a really clever man, and he had a sort of necessity to read. He didn't use, obviously, the global world, but to have a global approach to the problems, and that was really innovative for that age.
Renato, sorry, you are mute.
Sorry, I was mute. I was simply asking if there were new comments or interventions. I do not see any raised hand, or I imagine there are not. So I think we may close this first seminar, thanking again Professor Giuseppe and all the participants, the people who attended to it. I hope we will meet together on June the 1st. I remember the second seminar will be held on that day. So thank you all. I hope we will meet again on June the 1st.
Thank you, Renato. See you the next time.